Psychologically, interdisciplinary research requires not only abstract theoretical intelligence, but also social intelligence. Cooperative work is a social art and has to be practiced with patience. So there's a couple of things that are important here, a couple of things that are informative. We see the challenge of interdisciplinary research articulated in two distinct ways, one having to do with infrastructure and one having to do with interaction. So from the standpoint of infrastructure, the quote discussed the need to think about discipline-bound departments and the norms that stifle interaction. And then there's the problem of interaction, the need to understand the difficulties in communicating across disciplines and what they refer to as a particular form of social intelligence. So anyone who's familiar with interdisciplinary research has probably experienced this to some degree, and you may be wondering, why did I just waste a couple of minutes of your time reading you something that you already know? Well, the reason I like to start out with that is because it's not important what they said, but when they said it. So this was published in 1944 in one of the first mentions of interdisciplinary research in the scientific literature. So they recognized long ago these challenges, and the issue is that science still struggles with these same kinds of challenges. And the old management axiom is a problem defined is half solved. If we've been able to define it for decades now, why have we not solved it? And the question we should be asking is, are we so bold to think that we can overcome these same kind of problems that prior generations have failed in successfully addressing? And obviously, I think we can overcome them, or I wouldn't be giving this talk. And I think we can overcome them because there's a number of important developments that have been going on over the last decade. First and foremost, there's certainly an increase in collaborative research. It's research that's cutting across disciplines, where people in a number of different fields are working together. Just as important, though, is the policy, academia, and industry communities are paying more attention to it. They're making a more concerted effort to understand and how to improve these collaborations. But it's this last item, this growth in the study and understanding of teams, that I think is the real catalyst for change here. And what I mean by that is we've got decades of research coming out of the social sciences that have been studying teams in a number of different fields. And it really has matured in its own area of inquiry, and it helps us understand teamwork in a number of different fields. And what I have here are a number of logos from different organizations, professional societies that study teams. So in industrial and organizational psychology, a significant number of people there study teams. In the National Communication Association, they have dedicated researchers studying teams. The Academy of Management has a number of people looking at teams. But here you have interdisciplinary groups who get together, and within them, they also study collaboration. So there's Computer-Supported Collaborative Learning as an organization that looks at technologies to facilitate collaboration. The International Association of Conflict Management spends a significant amount of time looking at conflict and how to improve collaboration by mitigating conflict. And then there's the Interdisciplinary Network for Group Research, the new kids on the block. And we were formed specifically to bring together these different groups and have an annual meeting where we can talk about what we know and what is some of the cutting edge research for studying teams and improving collaboration. So with that as kind of a foundation, I want to now move to these research challenges. And one of the challenges that we all often hear about in the discussion of interdisciplinary research is, what do we mean by interdisciplinary research? So I'm going to spend a few minutes describing some of the distinctions of what we call cross-disciplinary research. And that's just a general term that we use to describe research that moves across different fields and integrates concepts and methods from differing disciplines. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with the distinction between multi, inter, and transdisciplinarity. And I want to provide a quick distinction between these. So first, multidisciplinary research is obviously a collaborative effort, and the goal is to provide this broader analysis of a research problem. And researchers essentially work independently or sequentially. They come together and they share their perspectives. And the distinction here is contributions are drawn from different disciplines in a way that their complementarity is leveraged. So in service of some kind of objective, researchers adopt but do not necessarily integrate methods, concepts, or theories. And it's this last point here that I think is an important one. When researchers work in a multidisciplinary team, they remain firmly anchored in their field. They remain firmly anchored in the concepts and methods of their respective disciplines. So if I'm a biologist working on a multidisciplinary team, I leave that team still a biologist. Or if I'm a chemist, I leave that team still a chemist. And that's an important distinction because we move then to interdisciplinary research, and this is a form of research that demands more than just complementarity. Here we talk about researchers needing to combine or juxtapose concepts from different disciplines, and the goal here is the systematic integration of ideas. And formally, the National Academy of Science defines interdisciplinary research as something that integrates information, data, techniques, tools, perspective, concepts, or theories from two or more disciplines or bodies of specialized knowledge. And the idea is to advance fundamental understandings and solve problems whose solutions are beyond the scope of a single discipline or field of research practice. And what's often talked about here is the need to think about how interdisciplinary research evolves into its own field. You see that quite often when interdisciplinary research is successful. People start to pursue their own area of inquiry, and that's how interdisciplinary fields themselves are born, through successful interdisciplinary research. Next is transdisciplinary research. This is a more complex form of research, and what we talk about here is the need to integrate and build from discipline-specific theories. And the way we like to characterize this is the idea of pursuing collaboration across levels of analysis, and we think about this as from cells to society. So looking at the micro to macro levels, often taking a system perspective where we want to develop a comprehensive understanding. And an important distinction here is a need to focus on societal problems and the development of practical knowledge. And the complement to that is to include translational partners. So including on the research team, NGOs, community members, industry partners. The goal is not only to inform the scientific research, but also to come up with translational solutions to address the particular societal problem that is being investigated. So essentially, with transdisciplinary research, the idea is to move beyond a traditional disciplinary perspective and come up with new methodological or conceptual frameworks that move across levels and integrate levels of analyses. So addressing this from the standpoint of how ARCIS should be conceptualizing this, the goal here is that to think about how you are trying to solve a particular problem to advance understanding, whether it be education, research, or practice. What are the best ways you want to integrate knowledge? And most importantly, to cultivate the involvement of stakeholders. And I know in climate science and Arctic research, stakeholders do play an important role. So the goal here is how to assist members to build collaborations to strengthen the research that needs to happen. But the main point, the main message I want to get across here is that ARCIS should help teams pursue the appropriate form of cross-disciplinary research. And what I mean by that is don't do transdisciplinary research if you're not ready to. Don't do interdisciplinary research if you're not ready to. Sometimes a question may only be ready for multidisciplinary research. A certain level of maturity in the field needs to happen before you can start to think about how to do interdisciplinary research and how to do transdisciplinary research. And Arctic research is a very broad category, and I'm sure within those areas of study, there are different levels of maturity associated with the particular questions being addressed. So that's why I think it's important to recognize that there are methods of cross-disciplinary research that are going to be appropriate for these research questions. So now I want to transition to team science more generally, and I want to provide a formal definition coming out of the social sciences with regard to what we mean by teams. We often talk about multiple information sources and the need for intensive communication. We build teams because members have task-relevant knowledge with meaningful task interdependencies. The challenge, though, comes in when you have these affective and attitudinal factors that produce the group dynamics, and this leads to a need to coordinate across the members and their specialized roles. And this definition is important because what we've argued is that you can reframe interdisciplinary research as a process of teamwork to be mastered. So going back to the original quote from 1945 and the publication by Brozick and Keyes, the idea here is that we can overcome these problems because we can leverage what we already know about teams. So we can leverage this tremendous body of knowledge from the study of teams in other fields and think about it as a way to understand and improve the activities necessary for scientific collaboration. So the argument we make is this makes the achievement and measurement of interdisciplinarity much more tractable. That is, we can use what we know about teams to improve teamwork and to study and measure teamwork to improve scientific collaboration. So out of that, we've developed the science of team science, and this is a new field with the commitment to develop the scholarly examination of teamwork in science. And our goal is to improve how scholars interact and integrate across boundaries. So Dan Stokols, one of the founders of the field, he noted nearly a decade ago that the science of team science was created because of the problems that researchers are now trying to address. Specifically, the inherent complexity of contemporary public health, environmental, political, and policy challenges leads to the realization that an integration of multiple disciplinary perspectives is required to better understand and ameliorate these problems. So at that time, Dan Stokols was working with the National Cancer Institute, and they were trying to understand the various research centers that they had been funding. And their idea was they need to come up with new forms of measurement because in prior decades, they've been funding primarily the PI form of research funding. And they now have funding that spans disciplines and spans PIs. And they wanted to think about how do we measure and how do we understand this new form of science? And what we've been arguing from a science of team science standpoint is we need to understand how to make full use of this scientific capacity. So we talk about this with this idea of integrative capacity. That is, there's a tremendous amount of intellectual capital on scientific teams. The challenge, though, is that intellectual capital is not always used. And we again refer to this as the capacity of that team. And what we need to understand more fully is how can we leverage that intellectual capacity to make full use of that knowledge so that we can solve the kinds of complex problems that we're trying to address. So in the science of team science, we've been developing this for a number of years. It first started when the National Cancer Institute had its conference on the science of team science, assessing the value of transdisciplinary research. Out of that came a special issue in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. If you are interested in this, this is available, free, downloadable, and it's a rich source of some of the initial thinking on the science of team science. The National Science Foundation started to get interested in this around that time. I held a workshop in 2010 with the goal being to bring together my colleagues in the social sciences who study teams with those people in the National Cancer Institute and the National Institutes of Health who had been dealing and trying to address this problem, with the idea being that we could leverage what we know from the study of teams to inform how science policy. And we've been working ever since then. We have had an annual Science of Team Science conference, and I'll be hosting the Science of Team Science this summer, and I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end. But we've been developing this research field for the past decade now. Most recently, the National Academies had a consensus study on this. The report out of that consensus study is available on the National Academy Press website, Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science. And what we did there was we talked about what are the challenges associated with collaboration in science, and we articulated the key features of scientific collaboration along these dimensions here, having to do with variations in team size, interdependency, boundaries, integration of knowledge, the diversity of the team members, whether the team members are co-located or not. And we articulated these challenges and we described what we know about teams and collaboration and how that body of knowledge can be used to address these challenges. But what we also talked about is some of the research questions that need to be further examined. So we talked about how what we know with regard to assembling teams. We talked about mechanisms for professional development, leadership development, virtual collaboration. A big one that's now being addressed is promotion and tenure credit. And this is a very challenging issue because this requires cultural change in the modern academy. So this is something we've been paying significant attention to. And I can share some of those documents with people if you're interested. But the message here is that ARCIS needs to understand that there's really a rich and robust body of knowledge, the scholarly literature on teams that can be leveraged. And we've compiled a lot of this in this report, Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science, and that's available free for download. So now I want to segue into understanding teamwork more generally and what we know about teams from the social sciences. And what I'll be describing here is some of the work that I normally do when I give these kinds of talks as workshops. I make this much more interactive, but I thought I'd try to present some of these ideas with you to give you a flavor of what it means to work and study in teams. And my goal here is to help you as researchers reflect on your collaborative processes. And what I mean by that is good scientists already reflect on the scientific process. So as a researcher, you already reflect on your research questions, you reflect on the questions of your colleagues, the kinds of work that your colleagues are doing, and you also reflect on the scientific work of your students. So you're already familiar with these kinds of metacognitive processes in which you engage as a scientist, but the point here with this next part of my talk is for you to recognize that to be a good team scientist, you need to reflect on team processes. In order to effectively reflect on these team processes, you really need to understand what do we mean by team processes. So here's kind of a heuristic that we use in the study of teams to help people understand some of the primary areas of study when it comes to teamwork basics. So we talk about the ABCs of teams, so the attitudinal or affective components, the behavioral or skill components, and the cognitive or knowledge components. So we like to say that teams think, teams feel, and teams do things. And they effectively integrate all of these when they work as a team to solve particular problems. And within each one of these areas or categories, there are specific concepts that we look at. We look at decision making and problem solving in the cognitive factor. We look at things like team cohesion, team trust under attitudinal factors. From the skill standpoint, we look at communication, we look at leadership, and researchers in the study of teams may look at one or some combination of these. And the idea is we want to understand how they relate to team process and team effectiveness. So another breakdown that I think is important for researchers to understand is the distinction between task work and teamwork. So this is an idea that came out of the study of teams and it came out of research on teams, particularly for team training. And what they realized is that normally when people think about training, they think about the task itself. That is what needs to be accomplished to meet goals and complete objectives. And this distinction is important because when we think about task work, what this really means in the context of science is the scientific work done by the team. And what this requires is understanding the relevant theory and the constructs. Task work involves the studies and executing appropriate methods. It requires the kind of analyses and the interpretation of results and writing up those results. So this is what we think of as task work in scientific teams. Contrast that, though, with teamwork. These are the attitudinal, behavioral, and cognitive factors that are required to work effectively as a team, to work as an interdependent team. And here we have these attitudinal, behavior, and cognitive factors. So the affective issues, things like teammate trust, the skills supporting interaction with teammates, and the knowledge associated with teammates, the roles and the responsibilities. And I want you to think about these differences because when we look at the modern academy, when we look at research, graduate training, and education, we normally only think about task work. That is, as a scientist, you've spent anywhere from 20 to 25 years in your education and in your postgraduate training focusing on task work. You're trying to get better at the scientific work in which you are engaged. Very little of the educational process focuses on the teamwork. You may learn teamwork implicitly through interacting with others, but very little of the educational process focuses on scientific collaboration. And this is really an important issue that we're trying to get across, and we're trying to develop ways that this can be integrated with graduate education and with professional development. And what we've been doing is trying to come up with methods and workshops and particular training interventions that can be built into your own professional societies and into your classes. So as part of that, though, what we'd like people to do is understand how to measure task work and teamwork. So one of the questions we're often asked is, well, we get this difference between task work and teamwork, so what do we need to do about it? And if you want to improve it, you need to measure it. It's a standard scientific issue, and one of the measurement techniques that I recommend is this one, the Comprehensive Assessment of Team Member Effectiveness. This was developed out of funding from the National Science Foundation, and it was specifically developed for engineering education. And what they realized in engineering education is that a significant portion of that education involved group work. And in their wisdom, they recognized that, well, we're doing a lot of group work in our undergraduate classes, but we're not measuring the group work. We're not measuring the teamwork. That is, they were looking at the content that students were trying to learn, and they were assessing the degree to which they had acquired the knowledge associated with their engineering classes, but they had not been looking at the collaboration processes. So CATME was specifically developed to help engineering educators assess teamwork in their classrooms so they can give students feedback and they can improve their collaboration processes. And I like this one because it's kind of a turnkey solution that you can log into and you can sign up as a team. If you use group work in any of your classes, you can use this to assess the group work. It's free, available free of charge, and it's very user-friendly on their website. And another particularly helpful issue about this is that they have behavioral anchors associated with the measurement there. So here's one of the categories, the degree to which team members contribute to the team work. So this involves self and peer evaluation. So you evaluate yourself, that is the degree to which you think you contribute to the team's work, and you evaluate your team members, your peers, and the degree to which they think they're contributing to their teamwork. And it's a combination of these that provides adequate feedback where you can see the degree to which your team members think you're fairly contributing to the teamwork, the degree to which you're interacting effectively with teammates, the degree to which you're keeping your team members on track. And over here, you see the behavioral anchors that can be used. So you would get the highest rating if you do more or higher quality work than expected. If you help help teammates who are having difficulty, you would get lower rating if you don't do a fair share of the teamwork, if you don't assist teammates, or if you quit if the work becomes too difficult. So this is a nice one for people who are not familiar with the nuances of team processes, because these behavioral anchors can help you understand what are good and poor team processes. And again, this is a measurement technique that's available on the web where you can sign up for use of this. Another important issue, though, is conflict. And when I do this in workshops, I have teams reflect on the kind of conflict that they experience. And this is one of the measurement techniques that I use in these, because it involves different kinds of conflict. And you look at things like the degree to which your team members disagree about the amount of time they spend in meetings. You look at conflict around personality. You look about friction in the team members. You look about tension in the team members. And what I want people to recognize with this measurement is that conflict is a very nuanced issue in and of itself. And the reason I use this particular measurement technique is because it has broken conflict down into 4 specific categories that I think are very relevant to scientific collaborations. First and foremost, there's this idea of task conflict. And this is important because this is a good form of conflict. That is, intellectual cognitive conflict is the kind of conflict that we want. We want to be able to discuss and debate and argue about ideas. This is the stuff of science. This is the stuff of good teamwork. So you discuss the pros and cons, you argue about the ideas, you come up with alternative courses of action, and this is the kind of conflict that you want to embrace, you don't want to avoid. It's these other kinds of conflict that are problematic and can hinder the team. And the reason this measurement instrument is important is because it helps you identify whether there's relationship conflict, whether there's contribution conflict, and for science teams, whether or not there's logistical conflict. So the logistical conflict in science teams can come up not only with regard to things like the time and resources, but with technology and equipment. So our team members effectively utilizing their resources to accomplish the task. So again, this is something that's freely available for use, and it's something that I recommend team members use if they want to understand what the kinds of conflict processes in their teams. Another issue, and this one I think is particularly important for ARCIS, is this idea of what we call multi-team systems. And these are the kinds of teams that are teams of teams. So a multi-team system is two or more teams that interface directly and interdependently in response to environmental contingencies towards the accomplishment of collective goals. And the challenges with a multi-team system is you have internal team dynamics, just like you normally do with any team, but you have to collaborate across team boundaries. So you have to deal with sub-goals that can be conflicting when you're working towards some overarching goal. And you need to examine how the problem solving unfolds within a team and across teams. And this is just a screen capture I grabbed from one of the initial publications on multi-team systems. And this was initially looked at in emergency response teams. So the context here is something like an accident, and the multi-team system is composed of firefighters and EMTs. It's also composed of the surgical team and the recovery team, the police, the dispatch center. And the reason I like this example is you can see the kinds of conflicting goals that might emerge here. So the police have particular sub-goals. They need to secure the safety of that environment, while the EMTs need to ensure the health and well-being of the accident victims, but those can sometimes be in conflict. And the elegant part of the multi-team systems research is it helps you understand the goal hierarchy associated with a multi-team system. And if you reflect upon the kind of interdisciplinary research that's going on in Arctic research, I think you can identify goal hierarchies and goal conflict that might emerge. So sometimes stakeholders may have a particular goal in mind, whereas the scientist might have another goal, and sometimes those can be in conflict. And when you can define this goal hierarchy and identify what the goals are across the stakeholder groups, you're more likely to successfully resolve the kind of conflict that might emerge. So this is an important kind of conceptual grounding that I recommend ARCIS consider. And this is a graphic that I pulled to help illustrate the multi-team systems associated with science. And you can't see it on the screen here, but this is something that I provided a link to. This is actually created by my university's library, because like many libraries, they're getting heavily involved in the research process. They're collaborating with our Office of Research, and we've been collaborating to try and understand the scientific process from beginning to end. And from beginning, there's the research planning cycle, the grant process, there's the grant management, the post-award process, there's the research, the publication cycle, there's the dissemination, the conclusion of the grant. This goes back into these ideas get created, and it begins all over again. And I put this up in the context of a multi-team system because all of these are part of a multi-team system. That is, we must collaborate with our offices of research. We need to collaborate with those who are writing up the findings and disseminating these findings. And this is just a nice illustration of the scientific ecosystem and the challenges associated with working across all of the different stakeholder groups who contribute to this scientific ecosystem. So the collaboration challenge that I want to put forth is that you need to understand that you're managing not just task work and the interdependencies of the task work, but also you need to manage the teamwork and what the challenges that arise from variations in knowledge and conflict. You need to understand the different kinds of competencies associated with collaboration. You need to recognize the different kinds of conflict associated with your collaboration. And you need to think about your teams as a multi-team system when you get into these larger collaborations that you sometimes see in Arctic research. So these are some of the foundational concepts that I like to provide to help researchers understand what is involved in scientific collaboration and what it means to work as a member of a team, because these concepts will help you reflect on the degree to which you think you're being an effective team member or not. So I'm going to quickly run through a few of these items under the category of preparing for team science, because I think these are helpful surveys and technologies or tools that are out there for you to use. And again, when I give workshops at universities, I have team members engage in the activities where they have to fill these kinds of surveys out. One is the research orientation scale, And this was developed by Kara Hall, Dan Stokels, and colleagues to try and look at the collaboration values and attitudes in science team members. And what they did was look at the predisposition people had towards research, and they came up with, through a factor analysis, measurement techniques to understand the degree to which people were unidisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or transdisciplinary. So unidisciplinary people tended to say things like, I tend to be more productive working on my own research projects than working as a member of a collaborative research team. Inter or transdisciplinary people would say things like, in my own work, I typically incorporate perspectives from disciplinary orientations that are different from my own. And I bring this up because this is something that you could administer within your teams or to others who you think about forming teams, because it can help you diagnose the kind of research orientation people may have. And similarly, the scholarly activity scales looks at the behaviors that people engage in, and it assesses the intentions for explorations of science team members and the behaviors that demonstrate the degree to which they effectively integrate the ideas that they come into contact with when they do their science. So this is another thing that you can do to kind of evaluate your collaborators. So from the standpoint of intentions for collaboration, so do these people read journals or publications outside their primary field? Do they attend meetings or conferences outside their primary field? When they obtain new insights, do they work with others through discussion of colleagues and integrate these ideas from different fields and different disciplinary orientations? So the scholarly activity scale is a way for you to assess the degree to which people have different effectiveness at integrating these ideas that they come into contact with. And this is something freely available for you to use in your scientific collaboration. And I want to also introduce to you, if you haven't seen already, the Team Science Field Guide. So the Collaboration and Team Science Field Guide was developed by the National Institutes of Health. This came out of their Ombudsman office that Michelle Bennett and Howard Gadlin ran for a number of years. And they developed this because in that office, they had to deal continually with the kinds of problems that scientific collaborators, scientific teams ran up against. So one of the important things that came out of this is the team science, what we jokingly refer to as the Prenuptial Agreement. And this is something that helps teams, before they form, work through potential problems that they may run into. And this lays the foundation for putting a system in place that can help and support the team through the development of trust. So it makes you precisely state your goals. It helps you describe how people will contribute. Importantly, it helps people delineate how to communicate, data share, how differences of opinion will be managed, and how to deal with reflections on potential conflicts of interest that might arise. So this is something that most teams experience, but very few teams reflect upon. And I bring this up, I wanted to highlight some of the dimensions that this prenuptial agreement looks at. And again, this is available free for download at the NIH website. And this is important because you have to look at who will do what in the team. You have to look at the mechanisms for communication within the team. And an important one that people often wrestle with are things like authorship and credit. So what are going to be the criteria, the process for assigning authorship and credit? How will credit be attributed to collaborators? Who is going to do the public presentation? Who is going to do the media inquiries? Who's going to do the intellectual property management? And an important one is, when is a project over? This is something few teams think about, and this matters because of the data that's collected. We all know that when we do science, we collect a lot of data, and in the course of a research team, that data can often outlive the project. So who's responsible for that data? Who owns that data? And again, teams don't often think about these issues. They only deal with them when a problem arises. But the prenuptial agreement is a very savvy tool to use because it forces you to think through ahead of time all of these issues that could potentially cause problems and could potentially hinder the collaboration down the road. So I'm going to end it there. Well, actually, let me quickly go through this last part. What I like teams to do is think through the variety of research outcomes that are possible when working in team science. So it's not just about publications, people. There's so much more outputs that come into mind when we collaborate. And these are some of the ideas that have come out of the science of team science. Deanna Pennington has talked about the material artifacts that get produced. She's talked about the development of new language that gets produced and the social ties, the kinds of collaboration skills. Jonathan Cummings and Sarah Kiesler articulated a nice set of project outcomes, the ideas that get created, the tools like software or hardware that get created, the education and learning processes that occur in scientific teams. So how many people earned their thesis or got jobs in academia or industry, how many people formed partnerships with industry, engaged in community relationships or collaborations with different researchers. So the idea is this is the variety of outcomes that we'd like to encourage scientific teams to think about, and you can use these to measure and evaluate the effectiveness of your own collaborations. So honestly, I will now end it there and open the floor for discussion.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. What an interesting presentation. Let me give people a little bit of instructions about how to ask questions. If you do have a question, please look at the top of your screen above the video display window and click on the white hand raise button, person with their hand sticking up. And I'll call on people with your hand raised so you can ask your questions directly. Before you speak, you're going to need to make sure that your audio is switched on by clicking on the green microphone button. And your audio will remain muted as long as the icon has a line drawn through it. But you can just click on the icon and that will make that happen. Does anybody want to raise their hands here at this point? Or also, alternatively, you can feel free to type a question in the chat box.
Yeah, and I see Britt has already provided some links to it. But within the presentations, I have some links as well. And I told Britt and Bob that I'll provide PDFs for the material that I've cited so you can use these at your disposal. They'll be linked with this talk.
Right, and we will be placing those on our website shortly after the presentation. One question that I'll start off with maybe, because I really think it's quite provocative the way you talk about teams as being a system that we want to really focus on. And as we do that, though, how do we deal with the traditional autonomy that individual researchers feel about their work? And is there a way to overcome the kind of sense of proprietaryship that individual researchers have to really get to the point where we can do teamwork more effectively?
Yeah, I think this is really one's dispositional traits. So there's certainly going to be room for people who don't want to collaborate. So the individual scientist who still wants to work on the PI-centered grant, that's fine. But one thing I often like to point out there is, even though you may be sole PI, you're still working on a team, and that team consists of your graduate students in your lab. But the second point there is, even for people like that, they can play a role in a science team. And what I mean by that is what most people don't realize or think about is that if you're on a science team, you're not continually collaborating. So teams really operate still independently. And when you work on a team, you periodically come together to work through ideas, you have your meetings, and these are all very important, but most of the time is still spent individually. So if you're one of those people who likes to sit back and reflect on complex ideas, you're not going to lose that opportunity just because you're working on a team. So I think that people need to recognize there's a space for both of those dispositions. And when you work in a scientific collaboration, you're probably only a small percentage of your time is actually directly interacting with others. And your main point about proprietary ideas, that's a personal trait. You have to decide whether you are willing to share your ideas. And that's a real challenge. And, I'm not going to pretend that that's not a problem. It's just something that people need to decide on their own.
Makes sense. So we have a question here from Chris Lund. Can you click on your microphone and try to ask your question here?
We can't hear you,
So
Chris, if you're trying to talk.
you want to try maybe typing your question in the chat box. Okay, the
Okay,
question
so
is, you mentioned that you'd like to integrate training regarding how to carry out scientific collaboration into existing diplomas that are oriented toward a specific discipline. If you've done this, do you have an example syllabus you can share with those of us who'd like to do something similar in our own higher education institutions?
sure. So there's a variety of methods out there that have been developed in either the team training space or in the learning sciences. One effective one is problem-based learning, and problem-based learning originated in medical schools, and it's kind of a case-based problem-solving technique. And what it does is it forces students to think about the kinds of content that they're trying to acquire, but also collaborate with each other to master that content. And a related process is called team-based learning. And team-based learning has overlaid onto problem-based learning specific facets of collaboration that are necessary for a team to solve those problems. There's also studio-based learning, which has come out of the engineering and design and physics kinds of education. And this is a much more hands-on, creative kind of collaborative process where the teams, the groups of students work with experts and instructors through kind of an iterative process as they try to understand a kind of complex problem. So I'm happy to send some of the papers where we've summarized some of these methods so you can read through them and see the different techniques that have been developed. Or if you just have problems sleeping, you can read that at your leisure.
Other questions? So another thing I might ask is with respect to the Arctic, right? To take this to the kind of system that we have where we have not just multiple disciplines and not just multiple institutions involved in understanding the Arctic, but also multiple countries, multiple cultures, and multiple geographies. Any suggestions about bridging those kind of things across your teams?
Well, I think what I would first want to do is identify what are the particular challenges associated with each one of those different stakeholder groups. So first and foremost, there's an obvious temporal dimension. So the temporal dimension comes into play when you're trying to coordinate, for example, a meeting. So this is an obvious one that has come out of the study of virtual collaborations. You've got people in different time zones. So there's actually software that's developed to facilitate that. When it comes to the stakeholder groups, though, I think I'd refer back to the goal hierarchy that I mentioned earlier. And with that, something like the Team Science Field Guide and the subsections in there that have people specifically articulate what vision do you have for this team? What outcomes do you expect for this team? That's going to force these different stakeholder groups to make explicit what they want to come out of that research. And the benefit of externalizing that knowledge is everyone's going to see it, everyone's going to understand it, and people are going to be able to interact with that kind of concrete knowledge, and they're going to be able to hopefully come to some kind of resolution. Because when you talk about the different geographies and the different cultures, I think people at best understand that there's differences, but the reality is they don't truly have a full understanding of what those differences are. So these tools that make explicit these differences are the kinds of techniques that need to be followed. And in my work, I refer to this as externalized cognition. You create concrete artifacts that become part of the documents that the team uses and shares.
One of the other intricacies that we run into in Arctic research has to do with the role of indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledge in informing the research that goes on in the Arctic, right? So not only are people working from different scientific disciplines, different fields, different organizations, but we're also often working from different knowledge systems, right? The concept of traditional and indigenous knowledge, you've observed an area and lived it and created your livelihood in it for a long period of time, brings a certain perspective to the equation. And I guess when you're trying to meld people who have that kind of knowledge into scientific teams, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, first and foremost, my primary thought is that's one of the most exciting, important developments that's come out of transdisciplinary research. And I just hope that anyone who has the opportunity to work with indigenous peoples really takes advantage of that rich body of knowledge that they have developed by being embedded in that place. So I think that this is an important issue when it comes to stakeholder groups, because what I've seen over the years is stakeholders playing a different role. So sometimes they're viewed merely as a source of data. You know, a researcher might go out and say, hey, can you help me understand this problem? They're kind of like a human sensor, where they're collecting some data for the research team. There also may be contributions from a more political, economic standpoint. So, for example, I've worked with some teams in the marine sciences, and they may be working with local fishers, where they have to look at the economy, they have to look at the politics, and they have to try to resolve. If you have the scientists who are saying you're overfishing, you're going to destroy this population, whereas you have the stakeholders who are saying, well, this is my livelihood. This creates a different kind of collaboration. But I think the best part of collaboration is when these people truly become a member of a team. And that's the point that you just articulated with your question, is these are people who have lived for generations in this place. And to me, the understanding of place, this intimate knowledge that indigenous people have, is truly unique. So scientists who grew up in the Midwest and you're trying to study something up in the Arctic region, you better be listening to these people who have spent their whole lives up there, because they have a body of knowledge that you can barely comprehend. And if you pay attention to them, I submit that you're going to come up with much more interesting, much better, more accurate scientific questions. So that's a long way of saying that I really encourage people to listen to those groups. As far as methods for listening to them, that's the kind of science of team science question that I think needs to be explored. But I will add that Gabrielle Bammer, who runs the Integration and Implementation Sciences group in Australia, she has a blog where this specific issue was just addressed. And I can provide a link to that, where they had one of the Australian indigenous people who works on some of these problems on these scientific teams described this kind of issue.
Fantastic. It looks like Helen Wiggins has a question. You want to tell us your question, Helen?
Hey, can you
Either
hear
that
me?
or
Just
type it in
added
the
my
chat
microphone.
box. Oh, yeah, we hear you, Helen. Go ahead.
Great. So this is a great presentation, and my mind is spinning, Steve. So you'll give me food for thought for days and days here. So one challenge that I think a lot of people in team science in the Arctic have had is those research outcomes that you were pointing to that aren't necessarily like a peer-reviewed publication, and funders finding value in those. And even things like just those discussions with stakeholders, right? So I would argue that's a valuable outcome, and that's been a lot harder, I think, to convince through either like proposal reviewing or funders that that's valuable. I guess, are you seeing any change in the culture of that? Is that just something we need to work on? Do we have to just be better at arguing why that's a key outcome?
I think that's going to be funder and program specific, because I know organizations like National Science Foundation do count these kinds of things. Outreach, they're paying a lot of attention to. They have been funding people I know to have workshops about communication with the public. So they recognize and value those kinds of developments with your projects. And I think as science itself evolves beyond the Vannevar Bush model of this dichotomy of basic to applied research and recognizes that research really exists to help us understand and solve problems around our world, these kinds of outcomes are going to be valued more. And I think that data, hardware, software, with this next generation of scientists who are much more familiar with sharing, those too are going to become recognized metrics. So, computer scientists have been doing and counting these kinds of things for a very long time now, but biology is now sharing data sets. I'm familiar with some of the NSF synthesis setters, which are all about sharing data. So I think that they're starting to produce this culture shift. Another one I'll add, though, is more organic and coming from the scientific community, and that's called alt metrics. And if you just Google alt metrics, you'll see some interesting developments there. And alt metrics was specifically developed to deal with the problem of citations being the primary metric, because it's obviously a huge lag time between publication and citation, but alt metrics literally looks at things like tweets and blogs. And if you presented somewhere and someone tweeted about it or someone blogged about a talk you just gave, that would count within the alt metric sphere. And you'll even see journals. So if you're familiar with the Frontiers group, this was a European publisher that was just bought out by Nature a few years ago, by the Nature Publishing Group. They actually have implemented a alt metric system into their publication. So anyone who publishes with Frontiers will see the alt metrics associated with that publication, and you can track much more quickly. So instead of waiting a couple of years for a citation, you can see that, hey, 3 people have tweeted your publication, or you've had 500 downloads already in the past couple of months. So I'm excited, and I think there will be these changes on the horizon, and I'd recommend that you educate your program managers about these.
Let me ask one more question to bring in one of these big issues we're facing with today, and that is the question of in this era where alternative facts have become part of the news, and perhaps there's some quarters where we're seeing less respect for the product of the scientific process. What can teams do to increase societal and stakeholder support and understanding and action upon the research findings that the teams are working on?
I think what matters here is a different kind of interdisciplinary collaboration. So I mentioned earlier that NSF has been funding science communication workshops. So there are people in research centers or in complex teams that actually have, as part of the funding, working with people from schools of communication, journalism students or students who are studying science communication. I've attended National Academies of Science meetings where they have AAAS fellows who focus on science communication attend those meetings and write up the discussions, write up the outcomes in such a way that the public can have ready access to them. So what matters is kind of interprofessional collaboration where you don't just rely on the scientists to try to communicate to the public. You try to bring in experts who know how to communicate with the public. And when I say that, I don't mean that scientists don't have to get better at communicating with the public. I just recognize that it's difficult for scientists to communicate with humans, and you should rely on people who are very good at doing that. But again, I think this is a generational issue because a lot of these communication programs are being implemented in graduate education. And these students are working as they're getting their PhDs. They're working with schools of communication and journalism schools to learn how to write better. And a lot of scientists are blogging. So they're already doing this kind of public education.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I really appreciate your presentation and the discussion. I see we're a little bit over time, so I think we should probably wrap up. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. And for the participants, encourage everybody to please fill out the survey that will appear on the screen when we're done. This webinar is an experiment for us, and we want to know what you think. Also, please let us know what other kind of member-focused activities that you'd find valuable from ARCUS. And finally, I just wanted to give Steve the last word here. If you wanted to say a little something about the upcoming workshop that you're organizing.
Oh, yes, thank you. Well, first, anyone who has any questions or if you're interested in any of the material or publications, papers I've mentioned, feel free to email me. Be careful what you wish for, though. I may overload you with information. But there's the annual Science of Team Science Conference. There's a slide that's in my presentation that you can see. This will be June 12th through 14th in Clearwater Beach, Florida. So I've gotten a hotel right on the Gulf of Mexico. So you can be in sunny Florida, and if you haven't been to the Gulf of Mexico, it's beautiful. On the first day, we have a set of workshops that are free with your registration. So you're going to be able to learn about various aspects of working in science teams. But then for the scientific program, it's going to be people who are studying science teams or people who study teams more generally, sharing their findings, sharing their ideas with the Science of Team Science community. And I always want what I call practicing scientists to attend this. I don't want to be around people just like me. That is, people who study teams. I want people like you who do scientific collaboration to attend these meetings because you are my stakeholders. You are my embedded population that we're trying to understand, and it's helpful for you to attend. And if you look at the invited speakers, and I can send you information on that, I think Bob has promised he'd share some of that on your listserv. If you look at the invited speakers, half of the people that I've invited are practicing scientists. So these are people who are embedded in complex interdisciplinary collaborations, who are funding these kinds of complex collaborations. And they're invited because we want their perspective. We want their ideas about some of the challenges they face, because this is a complementarity kind of science. That is, we want to understand the problem. We can only understand it by interacting with these scientists, but we also want to improve the scientific ecosystem.
All right, well, thank you very much, Steve, and thank you all for participating, and that will conclude today's event, and thank you very much, and hope everybody has a great day, and good luck.
Thank you.